So last unit, we had talked about the beginning of cities in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. That's what civilization actually means, is cities. Think like civic. And from this rise of cities in the late Neolithic and throughout the Bronze Age, concepts of things like organized religion, kingship, writing, warfare, empire, all of these were really invented during that period, during the first stages of civilization. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about these periods of Bronze and Iron Age that we've just gotten through. Bronze is made by combining copper and tin, and it can be really put together at pretty low heat. Once people figured out that they can combine those two things, it wasn't too difficult, though it was pretty expensive, primarily because there's no tin, or not very much tin, in the Fertile Crescent. They got most of their tin, actually, from Britain. There were merchants that had brought tin down from Britain and were able to combine all that stuff. But when we get to the Bronze Age collapse around the year 1200, with the collapse of civilization, we also have the collapse of trade. Tin dries up, and making bronze all of a sudden is almost impossible. However, there's plenty of iron all around the Fertile Crescent, really all over the world. And there had been a little bit of iron working throughout the Bronze Age, but in order to really make iron, to get iron out of iron ore where it's mixed in with other rocks and whatnot, you have to get it to a really high heat level. And that technology just didn't exist during the Bronze Age. At least it didn't have any widespread existence. But with the drying up of the tin supply, smiths had to figure out a new way to make metal. And essentially what happened is, just as the Bronze Age collapse was happening, metalsmiths figured out how to make massive furnaces that could really get things hot and really melt down that iron in order to purify it. And so this new technology of how to make iron became widespread throughout the Fertile Crescent, throughout the Middle East. From around the year 1200 BCE up until the year 500 BCE, we have something called the Iron Age. Now, iron itself is not that much harder than bronze, but one of the big advantages was, like I said, iron was everywhere. And once the technology to extract the iron was everywhere, all of a sudden, weapons and tools became much cheaper. And so now no longer was it just the super rich who could afford their own weapons. Remember, during the Bronze Age, the only people that had swords and whatnot were the people that could afford them, the aristocracy. But now, people of lower ranks were able to afford them, and kings, and this is important, kings that were again starting to solidify their power, they were able to raise much larger armies. This is why the Assyrians had such a militarized society, because they could afford to arm just about all their men, because iron was cheap. At the same time, throughout the later Iron Age, smiths were figuring out how to fold carbon into iron in order to make something we call steel, which is much harder than things like bronze or iron on its own. So we have deadlier weapons, and we have more of them. So again, the Iron Age was a period of warrior societies like the Assyrian and the Neo-Babylonian empires. It's also the period that the Hebrews were said to have invaded Canaan, though we've already talked about how that doesn't seem very likely, that probably didn't happen, at least not the way it's told in the Bible. And so it really is kind of the transition between the old world of the Bronze Age and the Classical Age, where they were still using iron and steel weapons and tools. And so by the time we get to the 500s, significant social changes were taking place. Democracy was emerging in Greece during that time. The Romans were throwing out their kings and establishing a republic. Coins were invented in Anatolia, or as it is here on this map, Asia Minor. And the Persians were just starting to create the first truly multicultural empire. You might remember the Assyrians and the Babylonians were all about destroying people's cultures. If people revolted too much or if people weren't subservient enough, they would just deport them to another portion of the empire where eventually their identities would all just become mixed into the Assyrian or the Babylonian identity. The Persians, as we're going to see, were much more open to multiculturalism. They let people practice whatever religion they wanted, speak whatever language they wanted, practice their local customs. They were not interested in turning everybody into Persians. So from 500 BCE to 500 CE, we have something called the Classical Age. And this is true mostly across all of Eurasia, all of Europe, all of the Middle East, all of India, Central Asia, East Asia. But in this unit, we're going to be talking about something called the Greater West. Now, you might have heard that term, the West, before. It usually refers to Europe and places where Europeans have settled. When we're talking about the Greater West, though, we're referring to Europe, also North Africa, and the Middle East. Early European civilizations got much of their culture from the Middle East. They got their writing from the Phoenicians, over here to the north of Canaan. The concept of an eternal soul came from Egypt and from Persia. The organization of empires into separate provinces and actually allowing each province to have its own identity but still report to the central government, that was a Persian invention. Even Christianity, something that will come to really define the West, comes from the Middle East. And so in many ways, European and Middle Eastern culture have always been culturally very closely connected. And so I just want to run through real quick the things that we're going to be covering in this unit. The Classical Age really starts with the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire, as we're going to see, is made up of several dynasties. The Achaemenid dynasty, or Achaemenid dynasty, is the big one. That's going to be the one that really creates the Persian culture that we think of. Though we're also going to be looking at the Seleucid dynasty. This is a dynasty of Greeks who had ruled over the Persians. The Parthian and Sassanid dynasties will eventually become the arch rivals of Rome. We're going to be looking at the development of Jewish identity and Jewish scripture. This will require us to look back a little to the Iron Age. But by the time we get to the Classical Age, something to keep in mind is that Judaism will be heavily affected by the Persian religion, Zoroastrianism. We'll be looking at this as we move through this unit, but it is the Persians who really give the Jewish people the freedom to try to rebuild their culture after the Babylonian captivity. And while they don't push anything onto the Jewish people are going to adopt a whole lot of Persian culture. Things like the eternal battle between good and evil. The concept of Satan doesn't appear in Jewish culture until we get to Persian influence. From there, we'll move on to Greece. And then in the late 4th century BCE, in the 320s and later, the Greeks, underneath a man named Alexander the Great, who, as we're going to see, himself was not Greek, but he was Greek enough. The Greeks and Alexander are going to conquer Persia and Egypt. This begins something called the Hellenistic Period, where Greek and Persian and Egyptian culture all become blended together. The Greek language becomes the main language for the Middle East and Egypt during this time, particularly for aristocrats and merchants. And this Hellenistic period lasts for 300 years, almost all the way up to the Common Era, where Greek, Persian, and Egyptian culture all blend into this amazing, vibrant society. And you will need to know this because it is going to be crucial for understanding things like early Christianity, which is going to come directly after this Hellenistic period. Before the Common Era, in the BCE years, we have the Republic, where aristocrats and eventually even commoners shared some of the power of the government. Though when we get into the Common Era, we'll be looking at the Roman Empire. And this is a time where Rome and its empire becomes increasingly dictatorial with an emperor on top. Now, Rome had been influenced by Greek culture early on, though the Romans certainly did have their own separate culture, particularly during the Republic. But by the time we get to the Common Era, those two cultures will become almost completely intermingled. The term you'll often hear is the Greco-Roman culture. Now finally, just as the Roman Empire is forming, we're going to be looking at a new Jewish sect that appears. Followers of a Jewish man whom Romans had executed, a man named Jesus, will be the beginnings of Christianity. We're going to be looking at those origins and how it eventually became the only religion allowed in the Roman Empire. But by the time we get to the 400s CE, the Western or the European half of the Roman Empire falls, and by the time we get to the 500s, the Middle Ages had begun. It's worth noting that the Middle Ages, or the medieval period of Europe, is an incredibly dark time. It is an impoverished time. It's a very violent period that lasts for about 1,000 years. However, the Eastern Roman Empire does continue on essentially for that whole period for another 1,000 years. And the Middle East is not going to experience the same type of hyper-violence that the European old portion of the Roman Empire will be experiencing during the medieval period.